I hope you're all having a wonderful day so far. You're listening to the TechFest Talks, a podcast by students for students. And I'm Raga with a brand new episode for all the science lovers and all the curious minds about diabetes.
With Dr. Dawn Thompson, a lecturer and a researcher from the University of Aberdeen. Hello, Dawn.
Hello, Raga. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
I've got some interesting questions for you today, and I hope they'll be fine. So let's get started. So my first question for you today is, what is protein tyrosine phosphatase 1B?
Well, basically, PTB1B is an enzyme, and this enzyme negatively regulates downstream signaling. So what it does is it switches off signaling. That's the very basic explanation of what PTB1B does.
Just out of curiosity, does it have any kinds of, I've read that it's a part of the human placenta and everything. Does it have any positive effects on the body?
So basically, it's a negative regulator of signaling. So what it does is it switches things off. It's mainly been associated with insulin signaling predominantly. So usually what happens is insulin is released in the body, and it binds to proteins on the surface of cells, and it binds specifically to insulin receptors.
Right.
And then what will happen is it will signal downstream, and really the ultimate or the end of this pathway would be to cause the uptake of glucose from the blood. So when you eat something and your glucose levels spike, insulin signaling will then signal to cause an uptake of glucose from the blood. And what PTB1B does is it stops this from happening.
Uh-huh.
So it switches off this signal.
Right. I think that answered our second question, how it regulates insulin. Yeah. So why do we need PTB1B inhibitors?
So basically, over the past few years, there's been a lot of interest in metabolic health and in type 2 diabetes. And there's been a lot of really education to try and have people to have more exercise, to eat a moderate diet. But despite this, there's still this exponential increase in people with presenting with obesity, and also increasing numbers of people who are presenting with type 2 diabetes. And they really have overlapping morbidities, where you have increased things like atherosclerosis, you have fatty liver disease, you have the progression to other diseases such as different cancers as well. So really, there's this urgent need with the numbers rising as exponentially as they are. There's an urgent need to find new medications, because people aren't just changing their diet and changing their behavior quickly enough. So they're looking for other medications that can maybe help with this.
That's great. Yeah. So can type 2 diabetes be cured or reversed? What is the best way to achieve this? And is there a point beyond which the condition cannot be reversed?
So the short answer is yes, it can be reversed. But there is a point where I think there's a point of no return. So initially what happens, so type 2 diabetes is different from type 1 diabetes, in that with patients that have type 1 diabetes, the problem is they don't produce insulin. And that's what's different about type 2 diabetes is that they do produce insulin. It's just the signals downstream aren't activated. And they aren't activated because PTB1B is inhibiting this function. So generally, what's usually first recommended if you're presenting with type 2 diabetes, or you're slightly overweight and you could be pre-diabetic, is that you change your diet and you do moderate exercise. And in those patients, the blood sugar levels do come down. And there have been cases when people don't need the medication that they used to. However, if you continue on this path and the type 2 diabetes progresses, then what can happen is you can also get beta cell failure, so then you don't produce insulin. And I think at that point, once you get to the beta cell failure part, that's when it can't be reversed. So I think early on, if you're able to change diet and do exercise, it will be able to be reversed. But if it goes too far, it'll be very difficult.
That's great. So according to online resources, PTB1B is a regulator of metabolism, which means that it decreases the amount of insulin produced by pancreas. How would that help if type 2 diabetes is caused due to the lack of insulin? I was just not clear with this.
Okay, so I think, so PTB1B is a negative regulator. Okay, so it switches off signaling. Okay, so what you want to do is, if it's to be used as a therapeutic, what you want to do is inhibit the inhibitor. So it's a bit like maths when you have two negatives. So two negatives, you end up with a positive.
Ah, right.
So what it does, if you have insulin signaling and it's switched off by the PTB1B, if you then block the activity of the PTB1B, then the signaling is be able to signal for longer. So it's sustained, so it's not switched off. So therefore, it should improve things.
Ah, right. So it switches off the inhibitor that inhibits insulin. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So it's basically it's like a double negative. So it's two negatives make a positive.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense now. Yeah, thank you. So are metabolic health and obesity correlated in any way?
Yes. So basically, if you look at any website such as the World Health Organization, any charities involved with obesity or diabetes, you'll see that over the past, say, 10 to 20 years, the levels of obesity have risen exponentially.
Right.
And in that time, all these other overlapping morbidities have also increased, such as type 2 diabetes and obesity overlaps, almost identically. Different metabolic health issues such as fatty liver, it also overlaps. And sometimes you have 2 or 3 different overlapping pathologies such as cardiovascular disease. So people with diabetes, they have accelerated atherosclerosis, and that is really further accelerated if you throw obesity into the mix.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things are overlapping. If you're looking at one of these types of diseases, more often than not, the patient will have 2 or 3 of these different comorbidities at the same time.
Right. So I just wanted to ask, do you know how you said obesity and metabolic health are quite correlated? But I thought obesity was caused by the fat, the extra fat that we get into our body. So is that somewhere related to inhibiting insulin or something like that? Or is that not?
So basically, it's slightly more complicated. So basically, you have all these positive and negative feedback mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when you eat? Your blood glucose goes up, and then what? So when you're hungry, first of all, you have a signal that goes from the stomach to tell you to start eating. So you will eat, and then your blood glucose will go up. Insulin will be released, and that blood glucose will be taken up into storage,
Mm-hmm.
and fat will then be stored as well. And then when you're full, you will get a second signal release that goes back to the brain and tells you to stop eating.
Yeah.
What happens now? That's generally a very good positive and negative regulator of feeding. What happens if you overeat is that these systems basically become desensitized. So when you eat, the insulin is released, but what happens is this system then, the downstream system is no longer activated by the insulin, so you don't get this increase in glucose coming in, uptake of glucose. You also don't have the signal then, the feedback signal that tells you to stop eating.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's just like a vicious cycle. So all the positive and negative feedback become out of sync,
Mm-hmm.
and so you don't have the signal that tells you to stop eating as well.
Right. So okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously that's extreme. It's not an all or nothing thing. This is something that happens gradually over time.
Yeah.
Is that you basically so people with type 2 diabetes, what they do is they get things like metformin, which stimulates blood glucose uptake, or they get different drugs that stimulate the body to either release insulin or to take up glucose to try and kickstart these pathways again because they're just not functioning.
Oh, could it be also the case where because you're overeating, then there's more glucose in the blood, and you might not have enough insulin for all of it, or is that not a possibility?
Well, so the problem is it's not the insulin, because usually you get increased insulin release in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it binds to the receptors to signal for glucose uptake, so that's what's called signal transduction. So you actually get amplification of the signal. The problem is the insulin is being released, but when it binds to the protein or the insulin receptor to cause the response, that's already been desensitized, so it's not signaling downstream. So it binds to the receptor, but the receptor is then not signaling.
Oh, right.
That's what happens.
So the body produces as much as insulin as there is glucose because of the amplified signal transduction.
So what happens is it releases the insulin, but the insulin, when it binds to the receptor doesn't signal downstream. So that's why the blood glucose stays high, because it's not been then taken up into the from the bloodstream.
Great, that really answers my question. Thank you. If you had to invent something to manage diabetes, what would it be?
So I think there's been great progress in recent years, especially with type 1 diabetes, where you have those monitors that's constantly in your arm. So you just need to put the monitor on to see what your blood glucose is, rather than having to prick your finger. I suppose the ideal thing, if you can't reverse the disease, I suppose the ideal thing would be to have some sort of technology where it would regulate your blood glucose for you, so you wouldn't have to monitor and then keep giving yourself injections or to take medication. That would probably be the best thing in an ideal world, if you couldn't cure the disease.
Mm-hmm. But I'm just this is out of curiosity again. But if there was a regulator with like that, would you have to keep injecting your blood into it because it requires blood to know how much glucose you have, or is that possible from not being in touch with your body or something?
Well, I think that, so if you've seen the monitors that type 1 diabetics have in their arm, so that's permanently on their arm. So that monitors their blood. You just then put the glucose meter over it, and it can read what the blood glucose is.
Oh, right.
So if you had something like that, but also instead of just monitoring your blood glucose, whether it could then decide whether you need some insulin or not, that would probably be quite good. But again, these sort of medications are being there's new medications and new ways of delivering medication that are being developed all the time.
That's great. I think this was an amazing episode because I was so confused when I was researching about this topic about inhibitors, because it quite didn't make sense, and they said PTB1B was it was a negative regulator. Yeah, but it really makes sense when you explained it to the minus plus way.
Yeah, cell signaling is what I think. What you have to remember is when you talk about cell signaling, it's not linear. So it doesn't go from A to B to C to D. There's multiple things happening at the same time, and if any little bits of those pathways are not functioning properly, it has a knock-on effect to further downstream. So
yeah, that was a great episode. Thank you so much, Dawn, for all that information. That was so amazing, and I quite think that was it was very clearly explained by you. So thank you so much for being on this episode. And guys, that brings us to the end of this episode, and it was an amazing episode about PTB1B, and I've learned a lot. I think you've learned a lot as well. So bye. Tune in for more episodes from the TechFest podcast.